Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this afternoon's webinar on the topic of attitudes and approaches to biotech. So this summer, Singular Talent did a survey to people working in non-lab and lab-based roles within biotech, and we're going to be receiving some kind of hot off the press results from that survey, and Tom's going to lead us nicely into a panel discussion and see if we can kind of come up with some solutions and have a bit of a conversation around those. So really looking forward to today's webinar. And just a couple of logistic points before we get going. If you don't mind keeping microphones on mute, that would be great. Cameras off, things like that, that would be fantastic. But we do like these sessions to be interactive. There is a chat box at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them in there and we will try and pick them up throughout the discussion. That is it from me. I will hand you over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Hello, everyone. I see some familiar names that have been logging in, but for those of you who I don't know, my name's Tom Froggatt. I'm the Managing Director of Singular Talent, who are a biotech specialist search and talent consultancy. And as Jazz said, we conducted two really significant pieces of research over the course of the summer, really looking at identifying. I think we all know that the world has changed as a result of pandemic and lockdowns and a looming economic disaster and war and everything that's going on. We wanted to quantify that a little bit and understand what that change has meant for people working in the biotech sector, both in terms of how they feel about their work and the things that are important to them in either assessing staying with their company or looking at other opportunities. So there's two pieces of research that we undertook. The first was a pretty wide-ranging survey, online survey, very in-depth. We went into, I think, 52 questions, all about how people feel about their current employer and their current employment situation. We looked at lots of different aspects of that, from sort of the work itself through to benefits and flexibility and buy-in to the company and everything that surrounds work, really. And within that, that was really about what are the things that would make them stay, what are the things that would make them leave. We overlapped that with a piece of research that we do every year, which is focused on an analysis of all the interviews that we conduct through the search work that we do. So this year, that was almost 1,000 interviews that we've conducted so far. And through that analysis, we looked to identify for each interview the main reason that the people we're speaking to are interested in considering a move. There's usually more than one reason, but we try to identify the main driver of that. And we look at the trends year to year in those things and how people's motivations are changing. So in overlapping those two things, there's several insights that we came up with. One of which I'm going to share to you today. For those of you who are particularly interested, my colleague Stephen, who is on this call, is also running a more in-depth webinar around all of the search results tomorrow. If you head to our Eventbrite page, you can register for that as well. But this is the world premiere of this survey and the results that we found, and particularly the key finding, which I will dive into right now. Couple of things to mention about this. The people that we surveyed and interviewed are almost exclusively biotech professionals. The vast majority of them are scientists working in drug discovery companies, although there are people from other disciplines who both responded to the survey and took part in the interviews. And again, the majority of them, I think it was 85%, are based in the UK. Apart from that, it was a really varied group. So all different levels of career across the country, obviously a concentration around the southeast, given where companies are, but there was people spread across the country and working for large companies, small companies, CROs, consultancies, and some independent experts as well. So the most interesting thing that we found in this survey started with the fact that, I've just talked about this, started with the fact that remote working and hybrid working is here to stay. So this probably isn't a surprise, but what we found was that 72% of respondents to the survey that we published are currently working remotely or in hybrid patterns, and the actual pattern of work varies. 76% of people want to either maintain or have more remote working. So very few people are looking to reduce the amount of remote working that they have. And 68% feel that they have sufficiently flexible working hours, which is a good proportion, and I think probably talks to some of the sort of results-driven attitudes of biotech companies and the output-driven attitude of biotech companies. So the first point to make is that it will be very difficult for companies to roll back any moves that they've made towards remote and hybrid working. And actually, anecdotally, outside of the survey, we are seeing instances in the search work that we do where we're talking to people who are looking for a job move because their company are trying to bring them back into the office. I think some of the caveats to this are that there is an understanding that lab work needs to be done in a lab. So that's not too controversial. There is also an understanding that there is value in being face-to-face. So there's actually very few of the respondents and the candidates that we interviewed were particularly looking for completely remote work. But I think where the tension came has been where companies have perhaps been bringing people back into the office more than those people feel is necessary. Now, whether they're right or not, it's difficult to say, and there's always two sides to that story. And I know as someone who runs a business myself, where we have quite a lot of flexibility, it's challenging to build culture and build connection remotely. But if you try to do that by bringing people back into the office and that's your go-to solution, there's going to be a good chance of losing those people. So that's point number one. I've sort of touched on point number two as well. But there is a growing sense of disconnection among biotech employees. I would say on this, before I dive into it, that we don't think these are trends that are exclusive to biotech. We haven't done any research outside of the biotech sector, but just looking at what people are saying elsewhere, I think these are wider spread issues, but they're certainly affecting the biotech sector. So in the interviews that we conducted over the course of this year, 15% of interviewees cited the nature of their work as the reason that they were leaving their job or considering leaving their job. And this is significant because it was the third most prevalent reason, and it's never featured in our survey before. People have left, or people have been driven in the past by working on more interesting science. People have been driven by having more impact, typically patient impact in the biotech sector, working closer to the patient. But the nature of the work itself hasn't featured highly as a reason for people to move. So the nuance underneath that, so for some people it was a complete shift in career. So some people wanted to retrain and move from the lab into a project management role. Some people wanted a complete shift, moving from being a geneticist to a photographer. But the majority of people were citing things like lack of resource and obstacles to completing the things that they needed to complete. So in many cases, that was bureaucracy and unnecessary administration. What we are seeing through these surveys and interviews is that biotech employees are very engaged with the work they're doing. They really enjoy the day-to-day of their job. They find it interesting, they enjoy science, they feel they're working on worthwhile things, and they also feel they're developing really valuable skills. And I think that came through in some of the findings that Stephen will talk about tomorrow about how valuable they feel their skills are in the market and how scarce their skills are. But things are getting in the way of them completing their jobs, and that's leading to frustration. The fourth most common reason for people leaving their work or considering leaving their work was due to culture or environment. This always, as a sort of overarching topic, features somewhere in that top 5 or 6 reasons, but the sort of detail behind it was different this time. So very, very commonly, people were talking about the atmosphere in their company having changed, communication being poor, there being a lack of clarity on things, if in small biotech companies, on things like funding and the runway of the company, or in larger companies on the strategy and the corporate reasoning behind doing certain things. So there are a couple of things that this says to us, is that although people are enjoying their work, the lack of connection that they have as a result of remote working, potentially, I think there's a good chance that that's the reason, means that they are getting more frustrated by the little things that surround their work than previously was the case. So the result of that is that you have a workforce full of people who perhaps are viewing their skills in a bit of a more transactional way because they feel less connection to the culture, less connection to the environment that they work in, certainly less connection to the people that they work with, particularly those who've joined companies during the pandemic and have always worked remotely with this group of people. They've not really established the same sort of personal connections, and less connection to the mission of the organization. So we're seeing these two factors that are interrelated and are at odds with each other, in that there's no appetite from the workforce to reduce flexibility. There may be appetite from companies, but there's no appetite from the workforce to have less flexibility or limited appetite. However, the flexibility that people have seems to be resulting in a lack of connection to their organizations. So this leads me on to the challenge facing biotech companies. And as I say, I think companies outside of the biotech sector as well, but this research was focused on biotech. The big challenge is, how do companies bridge the gap between flexibility and connection? The answer to lack of connection can't be bringing people back into the office. It won't work. You will lose people if you force them back into the office. We are seeing that across the portfolio of companies that we work with. So communication needs to improve, modes of connection need to improve. Perhaps there needs to be an acceptance from companies that actually this is a more transactional relationship now. But the challenge is how to engage people with the mission, with the culture, with the environment in a remote and flexible world. And so this, for me, was the most interesting insight from our piece of research, or the most interesting question that arose from our piece of research. I don't have the answer to that, and I think we've talked as a panel prior to this that we don't think this is a problem we're going to solve in half an hour. But this is the question that we are posing today: is how do companies rise to this challenge? I think that's my last slide. Yeah. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Jazz, if we could introduce the panel, that would be great.
Here we go. I'm just bringing you all back. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom, for the presentation. I had one question in the chat box just about sharing them after, and yeah, if you guys are happy to, then we can send those out after the session.
Yes.
So yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and I will hand it over to you guys to introduce yourselves.
Fab. Should we start with Soreya?
Hi guys, I'm Soreya Senior. I'm an HR consultant at Vinters, which is a Cambridge-based law firm, just really working with emerging companies, specifically in the biotech space, to help answer some of the challenges and questions that have actually arisen out of the survey, Tom.
Andy?
Yeah, hi everyone, Andy Carr. So I'm a group leader in pharmaceutical sciences. So I work at Charles River Labs in Harlow. So current role, I manage a team of 10, mainly lab-based scientists, but a couple of people that work remotely as well. Yeah, very interested in this topic because it's something we've come across quite a lot over the last year and a bit. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Andy. And John?
Yeah, hi all. So John Marsh, I'm a partner at EY, so Ernst & Young, and I operate in our people consulting practice. My market is health and life science. I've particularly been operating in the health world, so I was going to maybe share another sector perspective in terms of the current talent challenges.
Fab. So I think leading on to the first overall question I had, I'll stay with you on this, John, because as you say, you bring in a slightly different perspective to the conversation as well. how do these findings chime with what you're seeing both in biotech and outside?
Yeah, so I think we're all aware just from listening to the news that every sector, every employer is currently facing these challenges. So they're not unique at all to biotech. I was just looking at some data points, Tom. So just looking at some research from Office for National Statistics, you've got a record 1 million vacancies in the UK at the moment. So you've already got a gap between supply and demand. Microsoft did a survey and 41% of employees globally considering leaving their employer in the next year. And I'm just picking up on your hybrid point again, I thought a useful stat, and this is from our own EY research under what was called Work Reimagined, and 54% said they were likely to quit if they weren't offered the flexibility in terms of ways of working. So all of those trends that you'd identified within the biotech community are applying both globally and within UK. So perhaps later we can get on to again what our employers are trying to do about that.
Absolutely. And Andy, you're in the midst of it, running a team of scientists. Have you seen similar things? What are you finding out there?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I'm not surprised by those findings at all, and I think it has been a step change. During COVID, we essentially had to work in a hybrid way. We had no choice. And I think everyone was quite surprised how well it turned out, actually. I think if people had said we're going to throw this up into the air, we're going to have people working at home at different times, I think people would have thought it'd be a recipe for disaster, but it didn't. It worked really well. And I think people having seen that and having appreciated the benefits for their personal lives are quite rightly reluctant to go back to how it was before, because I don't think there's any need. The challenge we have a little bit is it was very easy to remote work if you're working in HR or finance or any kind of non-lab based functions. We found it slightly more challenging for people that physically have to be on the building, physically have to be in the building because they work in the lab. And I still haven't found, I think we're getting better at it, but still haven't found a way to square that circle yet.
Back at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember speaking to several CEOs about this sort of, I think it was probably a fear at the time, but I think it played out that there was two cultures developing in their companies, one in the lab-based staff and one in the non-lab-based staff who were working remotely. And I think it's, I don't know that anyone's answered that question just yet. But Soreya, and for you, I know you've been in the midst of this very recently, and you're also working with lots of different companies on similar issues. How are you seeing things out there?
Yeah, I think it's really consistent with the research and the experiences with Andy and John with what they're seeing. I think the interesting thing is that the conversations I have with people is, if it worked so well during the pandemic, why would you go back? The future of work has happened, and it's going to continue to happen. And actually, why would it not be a conversation to think about your hybrid and flexible working policies as, not waiting for people to have the requisite length of service, like make it your policy from day one, because people are asking that at interview. So why dismiss it out of hand? Just make it your day one policy, because it's not just a retention issue, it's an attraction issue. And employees are going to ask those questions, or future employees and candidates will ask those questions. So actually you need to be on the front foot of this, instead of sort of that and ahhing. It's like, well, we'll work in line with statutory or whatever. Actually make it your day one policy, because otherwise you're just not going to attract or retain the talent that you need within the innovation economy.
No, absolutely. And staying with you on this point, Soreya, I don't know that anyone's solved this challenge yet perfectly. I don't know if anyone's got the 100% answer, but have you seen things that perhaps companies have been trying to do to address this challenge, or things that have been good ideas or that have been working well? What sorts of approaches have you seen people taking?
So the majority of my time during the pandemic, I spent within Bio, and that was a scaling company. And my role was really focused on growth and the culture. And so what we proactively did was change the terms and conditions in the working environment. Everybody had the right to request flexible and hybrid working right from day one. And we had that written into the contracts of employment. We made it clear at interview that this was totally open to negotiation, and we'd want to understand their needs and what was going to work well for them in order for them to find meaningful work and purpose with the scientific work that they do. Even with lab scientists, we recognise that there are times that they could work in a hybrid way, but predominantly need to be more flexible, and we were open to that. And also in terms of that connectedness and collaboration, what we did was put together multidisciplinary teams for projects so that people could have that connection, you know, and talk about the culture and build the culture, even for those that were remote. And that worked really well in terms of creating that connectedness that people want. That sense of, because I think we're moving away from conversations, or I feel we should, it's my very personal view, around that whole inclusion and equity piece. And we're starting to talk more about belonging.
Right.
And that and people want to feel relatable to the purpose of the organisation and with each other, and creating that sense of belonging, of kind of, well, your role's remote, but I can connect with you. And people were happy to come into the office when we were able to. But I think we proactively sort of changed our policies and created that way of working and documented it through terms and conditions of employment, and equally just created an environment of connectedness and found different ways to do that. You know, we built the culture through online workshops, took people out of every day, you know, even the lab scientists would say, look, we're spending 3 hours to talk about how we build our culture. And that was really important, and it worked really, really well, because then people had that sense of purpose, belonging and inclusion that I think is a step forward, and in a way of thinking about culture, instead of it being something that's done to people, they are proactively engaging in part of it.
I think I didn't really talk about this in the slides, but I think there's been coming for a while now a shift in the balance of power, right? And sort of a lot of the time sort of reverting to pre-pandemic working patterns is about a feeling of control. It's about a feeling of getting your money's worth out of people and things like that. And I'm not going to point fingers or name names, of course, but that idea that the individual needs to contribute to the whole of the culture and how things are done and how they're connected to that work, but also to their own working patterns, I think is an interesting one, because I think we've seen here that you can't just assume that everybody wants to work remotely, because a lot of the time people don't. I hate it. I love being in the office. And some of the people who work here don't have a very good working setup at home, for example, and they'd prefer to be in. I've also found that people are actually pretty practical about this stuff on the most part. And, you know, if they need to be in the lab, they know they need to be in the lab. They've typically not got a sequencing machine in the garage that they can go and jump onto. But yeah, that involvement, I think, is part of a wider point around the power dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think about thinking about your physical office spaces. It's not, you know, people can feel culture and they know whether that looks or feels, you know, they get that kind of gut feeling, right? But I think thinking about how you create your physical office spaces as well and what they're used for. Yes, you absolutely need to have your lab space, and, you know, that's a given. But then what about your spaces in terms of, are they collaborative, you know, or thinking about, you know, the diversity of your team? Not everybody, you know, for the introverts in the room, I put my hand up wholly. I don't always want to be in that open plan office environment. I find it quite overwhelming. So, but I love collaborating with people. So, you know, what are those physical spaces actually that will enable you to understand the diverse needs of your teams, that will encourage them back as well? Because whilst we can create remote collaboration and that connectedness, actually, in my very deeply personal view, I think you can't be seeing the whites of people's eyes sometimes and having that, just that physical energy in the room. So maybe thinking about, what do your, if you're not going to have the same footfall, what do your physical office environments look like, and what do they cater for?
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, you mentioned earlier that at Charles River, of course, there's a large proportion of the staff are lab-based to a greater or lesser extent. Some of them, I guess, entirely so, or almost entirely so. And I suppose as well, whereas the answer to this question might be one thing for a small biotech company that's just raised $100 million and their money per head is huge, for a company the size of Charles River, first of all, and one that's based on a business model of creating value for your customers. What things have been happening there to sort of, I guess, connect the lab-based staff with the people who are working flexibly, and to do this in a way that's effective and practical?
It's been a challenge. I mean, the first thing we've done, which has been a success, and we were forced into this. I'd love to say it was a brilliant Charles River initiative, but it wasn't. We were forced into it by the pandemic, and we had to look at everyone's roles individually. You know, being a big corporation, we tend to have a lot of policies in place. If someone wants to remote work, there'll probably be 10 different policies for that you need to go through and go up through the corporate hierarchy. When COVID struck, we couldn't do that, because it forced us to realize that everyone's circumstances were different. So if you're looking after kids at home because they're not at school, or if your partner is shielding and vulnerable, everyone had all these different circumstances, which we kind of knew already, but weren't taking into account. And all of a sudden we were forced to do that. So we did what in hindsight I think has been a brilliant thing, which was devolved a lot of decision making around flexible working down to managers. So, and again, I think it was from necessity, but it came from the top of the organization, which was, you guys know your teams, you know what needs to be done, you know their individual circumstances, work with those guys and come up with working patterns that work at the moment. And people really appreciated that. People really appreciated the fact that we were going to, take into account all the things that are happening in their lives outside of work and come up with something that works. And we retained that. We retained that since. We are so much more flexible than we used to be. I think because we realised it works. It puts more onus on managers. It's a little bit easy if you've got a policy to just say, no, you can't have hybrid work. Don't do it as a company. So it puts more onus on managers like me to do their jobs properly and understand their team. But it's been a massive benefit. And I guess touching on how we handle remote working for lab staff, when we broke down what people were doing, there's very few jobs we have that are 100% lab based.
Okay.
So even if you are a lab scientist, we're a CRO, so we've got communication with clients to do, we've got BD to do, we've got report writing to do. So depending on how you allocate that, you can fairly easily give people tasks that they can do remotely. And as soon as if you can give people 20% of their tasks that they can do remotely, that's a day a week. Even 10% is, half a day a week that you can work flexibly, you can work from anywhere. So it's been, the interesting thing for me has been things we were kind of forced into doing, but worked really well. And we've just kept the best of them when we come out the other side of the pandemic.
Yeah. It's good to see that autonomy being passed down to the team managers, because I think it's quite a sort of common thing that, especially in big companies, team managers kind of feel like they have a lot of responsibility and not much authority sometimes to change stuff and to sort of enact the changes that they need to see. But that was sort of just handed down to the level of people who could actually make the judgment and enact it for you guys. Yeah. Excellent. John, I'm really interested in what you're seeing on this, because I think sometimes the biotech sector, and I say this with absolute love for the biotech sector, sometimes is a little bit guilty of only looking inwards for solutions. So, John, what are you seeing through your work at EY that's working for people, or that's interesting initiatives?
So just some very quick thoughts, just corroborating again what Soreya and Andy have said. I would listen to this and say, if we're asking, I'll just deal with the hybrid point. If we're asking people to come into offices, and again, we're seeing this, it has to be with purpose. So don't just tell people to come in, even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week, without actually having some clear, identifiable reason, rationale, both on ways of working. And I agree with Soreya, working environment. It really needs to be an opportunity for all workplaces to look whether they can actually shift and change how the workplace looks. We've invested internally on what we've called living labs, and we're currently piloting, testing, getting feedback on that combination between collaboration and one-to-one private space. The autonomy point is really vital, and the line manager point that Andy referenced. So what we're seeing is a much increased investment on the role of line managers in these times. So there needs to be you can't just assume that one set of terms and conditions will work for everybody. And it is around, it's more challenging for larger companies. I think smaller companies have got an advantage in this way to personalize terms and conditions more, understand where there's flexibility and choice, where there is leeway to shift, whether it's ways of working. And just thinking around your packages, some people might actually prefer to have a little bit more pay now because it is a real cost of living challenge, and we should not lose sight of actually how that's putting real stress now into workforce and retention. Pay's now become even more challenging for employers. So employers are having to think really deftly around where can they tweak under a cost pressure their current pay packages to make a difference. Quick reflections back as well, Tom, is if we're thinking around talent acquisition, every company, doesn't matter what size you are, should be really professional around how they look at their attraction and their offer. What is the employee value proposition? How is it tying back to the uniqueness of each and every company? Because every company will be very distinctive, and you need to spend the time and articulate to yourselves, to your satisfaction. And you then need to start sharing that out actually with your wider workforce, because if everybody needs to be able to identify, why would I work here? So that's your purpose. Why am I working here? Second, then, as we then start to move from an HR perspective into recruitment and onboarding, we underinvest both on recruitment and onboarding classically. We don't, again, make that always the most professional experience. In particular, the onboarding, we need to first of all go back, and all those who are interviewing really need, I think we're always a little bit reluctant to go, why should I be trained up in how to do recruitment? I know how to do recruitment. It's a bit like I know how to run a meeting. Most people don't know how to run a really effective meeting. Recruitment's quite similar. So we need to think through, you are going to be an ambassador, because it has to be very conversational to understand the skills you're looking for, but you're also having to explain the wider company. And then onboarding, again, that needs to be really slick. And onboarding starts pre-boarding, before the person has actually started. You've found a line manager, you've identified a buddy, they're in touch before, and then you are really being quite rigorous around that week 1, month 1, month 3, because we all lose too many people in the first 6 months because they've found that experience that they thought they were going to be moving into hasn't quite lived up to their actual experience on the ground. And with hybrid working, we've all felt it, we can feel quite isolated and lonely at times. So again, the line manager skills required to stay in touch and ensure then that they're asking all the right questions, listening as well, and being able to respond. So Tom, just some sort of reflections really, again, on experiences, regardless really of sector that companies are going through.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is common to just people, right? People working together. I saw a lot of nodding while you were speaking there, John. So Soreya, Andy, do you want to pick up on any of those points?
Yeah, I think that piece around investing in good recruitment strategies and making sure it's a consistent experience. So, you know, when you talk about your EVP, you know, we work with smart people, and, you know, it's the first question you ask on an engagement survey: would you recommend this as a great place to work? If people can't call it out what you're showing on a video or, you know, advertising a recruitment campaign, it takes one Glassdoor review. We know this. So I think you have to make sure that, you know, the lived experience is consistent with what you're articulating during recruitment. And then that recruitment experience, you know, because we all go into high woo mood when we really sort of fall for a candidate, but is that then consistent with how you onboard them? You know, even little things about the ease of, you know, a remote worker getting the equipment that they need to be able to adequately do their job well. Another survey question we ask a lot in engagement surveys, you know, do they have freedom of choice over the equipment they need? Are we making sure that, you know, even if, have you got the right chair? You know, it's really simple things that will make all the difference to that experience. And then actually making sure that the manager understands their responsibilities. It's not something you shunt off to HR. HR, in my view, are there to coach, support and advise the managers on how they support and lead their teams. And then how do managers who, you know, we know that, you know, we get into the situation a lot in the biotech space, but also in other sectors where, you know, people are promoted from being a technical manager into being a leader because they're good technically, but actually do they have the human skills, i.e. good communication, you know, delegation, to be able to empower those individuals so that then they're, you know, they've got everything they need to be able to do their job well. They understand their responsibilities and their accountabilities, but then do they have the skills to then continue empowering that person into peak performance in the role, which again will allow for engagement and retention. And I think, you know, it's a consistent experience. They're not pigeonholed processes. And I think if you think about that in terms of employee journey and an experience, that will help you build out your EVP, because it's a true lived experience. It's not just a separate thing that we talk about in a lovely PR campaign. It's actually really what happens for the organisation. And I think that investment in understanding your benefits, it's not just something you need to do. You really need to think about what kind of benefits you're offering and how that kind of leans into diversity of your workforce. So being pragmatic around that, and actually the more savvy you are, the more return on investment you'll get for those benefits that you offer. And just thinking about those in a more joined up approach as well, I think is something to really think about. And then how that relates to just well-being in general. It's not just about mental health awareness. Whilst I would advocate that every manager undertakes mental health training so they know how to spot early warning signs, it's not just for mental health champions or first aiders, it's very much a manager's responsibility actually. And I would think about that whole well-being piece again, which leans into people's diversity and their belonging and inclusion. The organisation, which is a little bit more holistic, but actually those are things post-pandemic that candidates are really thinking about. How are you going to look after me? You know, are you aware of my personal needs that I may have around my mental health and well-being, and how will you support that? So I think, you know, people are looking for that kind of partnership way of working, less hierarchy, a bit more agility around decision making. What's the general energy of the organisation? And I think they're the things that, you know, organisations need to think of if they're becoming a more human-centric, purpose-led, values-driven organisation.
Yeah, agree. Andy, anything to add to that?
Completely agree with the value of onboarding, and it's something we've invested a lot of time in improving over the last few years. Everyone starts the first day of their job very, very enthusiastic, probably a little bit nervous, but very enthusiastic.
Yeah.
And you want them to still be like that at the end of their first day, at the end of the first week, at the end of their first month. And it's so important to set the tone right at the beginning. It's on my mind at the moment. So I've got someone new starting in a fortnight, so I'm planning for that at the moment. But it's you want people to feel like they've made the right decision joining the company. And I think talking about the company's purpose and values and culture up front, you know, day one, day two is really, really important. People increasingly want to feel like they're part of something that is bigger than them and worthwhile, and articulating those goals is very, very important. One of the challenges I have doing that is I work for a company with 20,000 people, but I'm leading a team of 10 people. And ideally, I would like people to feel attached to the 20,000 people company, but also attached to the, you know, the narrative and the work we're doing as a team. So I'm constantly trying to strike the balance between those. I'm building on something Soreya said as well. We need better managers now, and so certainly something we've been trying to do is separate out scientific management from what we call people leadership. We don't even call it management now, we call it people leadership. And that's really a recognition that we want our best scientists doing science, and we want our best leaders leading and taking care of people and doing the right things. In practice, it's not always easy to do. So my job is, I don't know, probably 50% science and 50% management. But equally, we have people who are just as experienced as me, but concentrating on science. And I think making room for managers to do all this stuff, which we know we need to do, but it does take time and it does take thought, and just creating that space for managers to do that, because what everyone's saying has been moving towards a more individualistic approach and treating people as individuals rather than applying blanket policies is 100% the right way to go. But it does take time, and it takes good managers to make it happen.
Yeah, and interestingly, I think we're not necessarily talking about any new management theory or anything like that. It's just that you can't cut the corners you used to be able to get away with, because those personal relationships aren't necessarily as strong, or because there's more expectation from people. I think that's causing challenges for managers that perhaps should have been addressed but didn't always have to be. You could kind of get away without doing things in
and Tom, I think it's a very valid point made by Andy, that maybe we're not always ready to admit that not everyone is necessarily naturally going to be a very effective people manager, and sometimes you shouldn't be trying to force the square peg into the round hole shape. So in a HR world, sometimes you have more of a Y-shaped career pathway, and some will go up more of a technical route, some can go more managerial, and ideally you want to equip most people to be effective with other people, because that is a good life skill and a good work skill to have. Some people can be better maybe at task managing. We, in our consulting world, we take the people responsibility, we assign people the role of what we call counsellors. And again, we've had the discussion around, do you create a bit more of a super counsellor and value and recognise that role for the more developmental people management side, while you can still be task managed by someone else. So I think it's a really valid point made by Andy.
Absolutely. I can see we have a question from Beck here. I'll come to that in just a second. I have seen it. The only other thing I was going to add really was just some of the things that it's picking up on some of the things that you guys have been saying there, but some of the things that we're seeing as well is I spend a lot of my time talking to our clients about what stories they're telling in different contexts. And that's not just about what they're saying, of course, it's about how they're behaving and everything else that goes along with the experience of either being part of a company or interacting with the business. And I think there's a couple of things that I think you can use to create this connection even in a remote world. The first is the good news is that people are really connected with the work they're doing. They're really enjoying the work that they're doing. They are, for the most part, they feel they're in the right career and they're in the right job itself in terms of the tasks. So some of it, picking up on your point, Andy, I think is about making sure it's really clear to people where that thread is, from what they're doing every day to what the team is delivering, to what the department is doing, to what you're trying to achieve as a business overall. And especially in larger companies, that becomes more difficult because it's a longer thread. But everybody has an impact, and what everybody's doing every day ultimately contributes to where the business is in 10 years, right? And so I think that's the first story that we're talking to people about, telling their staff is how does what they do connect to the bigger picture, and telling it a lot more than they think they have to. I tell my team every quarter, and I'm sure they're sick of it by now, and I could not attend one of the presentations and just leave them to do it for me, I'm sure, but it's really, really important to keep that in mind, keep that forefront. And then I think as well, the bit that this is sort of me with my sales hat on, applying it to people situations. Got to think about what's in it for them at all times, whoever you're interacting with. I think, as I mentioned earlier, and as we touched on in some of the conversation, the balance of power has shifted, and people have a lot more mobility. They have a lot more options. If they're not getting what they need from a job or from an employment relationship, they can go somewhere else, especially in this sector. They've got really specialist, really in-demand skills. And they can probably go somewhere else and make more money, and they can probably go somewhere else and have more flexibility. It previously was the engagement with the company that stopped a lot of people from doing that, especially in startup companies. And if that disappears, then you're suddenly in a real dogfight for talent. And so being kind of commercial about this and looking at this from the same way a salesperson would look at it, whoever you're interacting with, what is in it for them? What do they want? What are they getting out of this? How are you helping them to achieve what they want? And that might be L&D, that might be career development. These are the two things that are the main factors in driving people's moves that we find. It could be the flexibility. It could be that they are, people are very grateful often for flexibility above and beyond what they think is reasonable. So it might be reasonable for you as an employer, but if you let them start at lunchtime and work late or whatever it might be, then if that works for them and they can't find that elsewhere, then that creates a sense of connection as well. So figuring out what's in it for them, and that's about knowing your people individually, which again is where line managers become so important. It helps you to tell the right story. So yeah, I'll talk about stories till till the cows come home. But I think it's a really key part of retention and recruitment. You know, you've got to tell the right story to bring people in, and that's a slightly different audience as well. Perhaps a less critical audience sometimes. But I do want to address the questions. We do want to make this interactive. So Becca's asked the question. Thank you for asking this. Does anyone have experience of a belonging project or initiatives that could work for a multi-site startup biotech reluctant to allow work from home for office space roles, such as a project manager? And I think, Soreya, you had a few ideas around that.
Yeah, I think my first question is, why would the organisation be reluctant around that? So that'd be my first question. But I think, you know, there's so many tools out there to keep people connected that you can use, especially from a project management perspective. But I think that belonging piece is, again, it comes back to your onboarding and making connections and that support network that you build with, it goes just beyond a buddy and your manager. I would say, so I would make sure that they've got, you know, really clear objectives as well, and help them develop their own internal network, because it's hard doing project management in early stage companies. You know, we know that it's a hard job. It's a bit of a thankless task, if I'm honest, for some project managers in those early companies, because you've got developmental scientists who are, you know, they don't want to be reined in, with all due respect. And so I think it's about, you know, creating those communication tools, creating a support network, and going beyond that kind of buddy system as well, but having really clear objectives, I think, as well for that person. I think not sure I can get my head around the fact that they wouldn't let a project manager home and do the job remotely. So I think that could be a big broader conversation, I think, Beck.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm still trying to get my head around it myself, but good tips. Thank you very much.
I don't know if it would work in your situation or not, Bex, but something we did to drive kind of team belonging was we started what is essentially a kind of scrapbook of stuff over the course of the year. We call it our Team Wins scrapbook, and it's just a PowerPoint deck. And if anyone does something they're particularly proud of, they whack a slide into the PowerPoint deck, or you put the one in for someone else. You know, anything good that's going on, we put into the deck. And every team meeting, we pull it up and we go through it. And it's got a really nice purpose, and it lets you know what other people are doing. You haven't physically been on the same site as them, or you've been working on a different project. We normally have a bit of banter around it. People compete to do the funniest slides and all that kind of thing. It brings a nice sense of team unity to it. And we always go through it at the end of the year. So, you know, when we sit down Christmas time, we'll go through. Got a really nice record of everything that we've done that we're proud of over the course of the year. And it's also a really nice thing to show people as part of their onboarding, because it kind of sets the culture of celebrating other people's successes, and it ties into the narrative of the team through the year. And I thought it was a little bit cheesy when we started doing it, but it's not. It's been absolutely brilliant for several reasons.
Yeah, and just to give again some thoughts around this, because it's as ever, it's never one activity, is it? It's in terms of belonging. Again, I'm going to connect it back to the purpose of the organisation. So what you want to ensure is that your communication messaging is always consistent back to that purpose, and also you're linking your stories. I think Soreya mentioned stories, for example, so that you're highlighting on your intranet really nice, inspiring examples of where people have actually done something that's connected back to the purpose of the organisation, and you go, I feel that resonates with me, I can understand that. I think sustainability, CSR matters, so you think again around what is people feeling that connectivity. So again, I would say ensure that you have, and they can still be old-fashioned community volunteering type days where people actually have the opportunity to again engage together. Third, in terms of building that communities, so again, it might be multi-site, people who are project managers, ensure like there is a head of profession for project managers, for example, who can operate multi-site. They bring together those people who are in that particular skill set, so they're not feeling that they're just office workers and it's the science guys who are being most recognised. You then start supplementing that. I think it doesn't matter what size organisation you are to have those recognition schemes. So within EY, we have what we call an applause site. Now, we've actually empowered managers we give them a small amount of cash each year. They can actually distribute that. But what has been really popular has been take a bow cards. I even had one today, dare I say, for my own EA, my secretary, because she just said, help, I need, can you help me with something? And then she sent me one. So it's very non-hierarchical, and it's really touching to get that. We've also found, again, working with clients, that there are some more systematic, and I think this links back to your EDI policies and approaches, carefully thinking around how you run some sessions about what does belonging really mean for people. So we've had feedback that in terms of diversity, we're now having more and more people joining us from non-traditional backgrounds where parents haven't been to university. They find themselves in this job market now, workplace. 60–70% of people have come from quite a traditional background where parents have been to university, and they are the first of their generation. We need to be really mindful and listening in terms of what that experience is like. So you will find that our clients will sometimes want sessions, and it's trying to understand what privilege is, what does it mean to be in an in-group and an out-group. So those need to be with your HR teams properly managed, but at least it makes people feel they've got a voice and that others are listening to, and what it is to be an ally to people who maybe don't feel that they're belonging. So just thought those might just be some helpful examples. And again, for me, it doesn't matter whether you're large or small as an organisation, you can still be doing this.
Yeah, and I think just a final thought around that, might be slightly off-piste, but just reading back your question again, Beck, it sounds to me like they have a cultural issue and that they haven't really defined their culture. And I think they need to have a come to Jesus or whatever their chosen deity is, and a bit of a heartfelt conversation with their leadership team about, you know, why do people need to belong, whether in the office or out the office? Why can't they work in a hybrid way? So it sounds like they've probably got a cultural issue that they need to address.
Yeah, you're exactly right, because they're so new. They don't know what they are. They don't know what their proposition to the market is yet. And I think that's probably a bigger sticking point that's feeding into the belonging piece and why people need to be physically in certain spaces. But I think, yeah, that it goes back to that cultural and that strategy piece to begin with.
Yeah, it sounds like a bit of an education on the leaders for that organisation.
Yeah, I'm trying. Yeah.
So, interestingly, I've seen a fairly clear negative correlation between the amount of flexibility a company is willing to offer now and the, let's say, experience level of the leadership team and the CEO, which is not actually, there's more to it than that. I think it's really hard to deprogram 30 years of how someone's been working. And if they're in that position, probably working really successfully. And so, you know, someone with that level of authority, particularly in a small company, that level of influence, if they are absolutely convinced that everyone being in the office is the right way to go, and they've been convinced of that for decades, it's going to be hard to unpick that. And so it would take a lot of chipping away. But I think just picking up on some of the things that people have said here, I think people do underestimate the power of helping people to feel a sense of professional satisfaction, helping people to feel valued and seen by others, and that what they do is having an impact and making a difference, even if it's just the person they sit next to, virtually.
I think it's really important for these early stage companies to really be deliberate around defining their culture and their values, which not for them just to hold the employees accountable, but equally the employees will hold the leadership accountable. So I think defining it and setting those behavioural standards of what it is and what it isn't will really help, because then when they come across these issues around that sense of belonging, whether you work in the office or out of the office remotely, whatever you want to label it as, I think it will help them. But I think people think this culture is this organic thing, and it is to a certain extent, but you also have to nurture it and be quite deliberate around it as well.
But the one thing around, I'm going to stick up for managers a little bit here. It used to be easy to monitor what people are doing. Yeah, if people are in the office, you see them 8 hours a day, you know what you're up to, you know what they're up to. A lot of reluctance for letting people work from home is because you have to evaluate what people are doing in a different way. And you have to evaluate outcomes rather than inputs. So and it is something you have to get your head around as a manager. But ultimately, if everything that needs to be done is being done and it's being done well, does it matter where people are doing it? And that's the mindset that all managers are trying to move to at the moment. But it is slightly hard to let go of that feeling, be able to of feeling in control, of seeing what everyone's doing. And it does require a leap of faith with your employees, but it is 100% worth doing it. But in most circumstances where there's reluctance for remote working, it's that slight fear from managers, and they're not making that mindset to managing outputs rather than inputs.
I think that's 100% true.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the basics of trust and communication, which are the foundations of every culture and every high-performing team. And that takes time. I completely agree with you. It takes a mindset shift, but it's worth the emotional investment, let alone the time investment and the financial investment to build that skill and confidence in teams in general, I think.
Yeah,
It's terrifying when you first start doing it, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile anyone just Googling, having a look. I agree, Soreya, about high-performing teams, the Lencioni model, because it's exactly based on the foundation of trust, and you have to establish that. There are ways of doing it, and then you start understanding how you can have healthy conflict as well, because that is critically important, again, for high-performing teams.
We've created a lot of depth from this question. Thank you for that, Beck. There's also a second question that came up around, can anyone suggest ideas to retain employees in the biotech sector? We've only got a couple of minutes, but hopefully actually that discussion has given some ideas around retention. Any very quick things that anyone wants to share that, that you think have been real difference makers to retention?
Clear career progression has been massive for us.
Yeah.
We revamped our career ladders to have more promotion points and to better define those promotion points. And the idea is that we've got really good learning and development set up now, and everyone understands the job they're doing at the moment. But they also understand the requirement for jobs they'd like to move into, and having that clarity has been a really big driver for us in retaining people.
Yeah, I agree. I think being able to, and we know as people who hire, we're looking for breadth and depth of experience. So actually giving people that opportunity within the organisation to get that breadth and depth of experience through a variety of different experiences. It's not just about that job title and ladder creep, which we know happens and where we end up with the Peter principle. But I think giving people the opportunity. So one thing that we did in our bio was we moved to role-based working. So we were able to capture the activities that everybody does, and there's a software available that helped us to do it called Peerdom, where actually people then could see, oh, actually there's a role here, or I think there's a need in the organisation. Could I do that role? And then we identified the level at which the role needed to be done, and we could create that learning and development to bring them up to that level, but recognising that there would be scope for them to grow into that. And that creates retention for people, as you say. It's, career paths aren't linear anymore, they're not straight. Mine has definitely been squiggly over the last nearly 30 years. And I think recognising that as well, and destigmatising the fact that it's okay to do lots of different things to gain that breadth and depth of experience, and it's about the human skills, I think, and building that into your organisation is really important for retention.
Absolutely. And through the surveys that we do and the analysis we do every year, career progression remains and has been for years the #1 reason that people move jobs. And it is typically that clarity of career progression, or lack of it, that drives that move. But I can see Jazz looking at me here, so I think we've run out of time.
Thank you, guys. That was a really interesting discussion. I was sat in the background nodding my head like one of them dogs that sit like on the dashboard of a car the whole time. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear some practical examples that people can kind of hopefully go away and implement if possible. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to everybody that tuned in. And we hope to see you again at one of our next webinars.
And feel free to come along tomorrow 2 till 3 for the rest of the survey results. You can find it on Eventbrite.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.